I can tell you that Schindler's List is not the feel-good family movie of the century. It's a story about the Holocaust. It's a story that was written in book form first, and it was actually handed down through oral tradition by a man who was a leather worker, owned a leather shop in Los Angeles by the name of Leopold Page. Leopold Page and his entire family were on Schindler's List. It's a story about a man named Oskar Schindler, who was a Nazi industrialist who saw the atrocities of the Holocaust and decided that he would use his wealth and his fortune in order to save as many people as he could save. And so he would go to the commandant of this concentration camp, one of the largest concentration camps in Germany, and he would speak to the man you saw him speaking to here in the movie, Amon Goeth. Amon Goeth was one of the most bloodthirsty, horrible human beings in the Nazi party, and he was the commandant of this huge camp, and Schindler would purchase the pardon and purchase the slaves, the Jewish prisoners, from him in order to bring them to his factories and to save their lives. In this clip, he says this, that the power to kill is not power at all, but it's the power to forgive. It's the power to let someone go. It's the power to find someone guilty and to allow them to continue to live. And that brings us to our first big idea this morning as we talk about this epic God, this God of wonder who gives us gargantuan grace. And the big idea is this. It is grace and not punishment. That it's in grace and not punishment that God shows us his true life-changing power. Throughout history, people have seen stories of grace. Stories where people have garnered hope in the midst of injustice, and sometimes when they have gained hope in the midst of justice. They see these stories that represent grace as truly epic stories. The story of Oskar Schindler is an epic story. It's not a family feel-good story. It's a tough movie. It's one of those that I say, like Titanic, that I've watched once and I'll never watch again. But it's a story about grace. God's story is a story about grace as well. It's a story about finding people guilty, yet allowing them to go on. Not only that, but they do more than the emperor's story. The emperor's story is that he finds this man who is guilty, he throws himself on the mercy of the court, and the emperor allows him to live, and he goes on. But with our God allows us to live, and he draws us near. This morning, we're going to talk about gargantuan grace. In being recaptured by wonder, we would be remiss to find wonder without finding God's grace in the midst of it. That leads us to our next big idea. And that is, the wonder of God cannot be experienced, and grace cannot seem amazing if we fail to find and comprehend grace in its proper form. It's one thing to understand that we are saved by grace. It's one thing to understand that we are guilty before God, and God, because of his great mercy, saves us for something that is better in the future. The problem is that so often we lose the wonder of God because we are not in full understanding. We're not in full comprehension of what we are saved to. That's a big question. This morning, I want to go back to the epic story, the story we started last week, the story of Moses and the Israelites as they escaped from Egypt. And as I set up this story, we know from last week that the Israelites, they escaped through the Red Sea. The Red Sea closes over the Egyptian army, and God leads them with a pillar of fire at night and a cloud by day, and he takes them on their way to the promised land. We also know that the Israelites are pretty good at complaining. They can continue to complain against Moses, and for every complaint, God supplied their needs. We know that water became sweet because of a tree that was thrown into the water. We know that food fell from the skies. And in order to feed 2.5 million people, it would take 1,500 tons of food every day falling from the skies. We know that when they became thirsty later, that water came from a rock, and God continues to show his people his providence as he leads them through this wilderness. And now they've come to a place called Sinai. This mountain in the middle of nothing, and it's the mountain of God. It's the place where Moses will walk up to the mountain and he will meet God in the burning bush. And in this place, God and Moses have a conversation in the book of Exodus that lasts quite some time. The conversation starts in chapter 18. It goes through verse 31. And in this conversation, God tells Moses his plans for his people. He tells him what it's going to take for them to live in community together. And then we find out as we pick up this morning in the story that Moses had really just been gone too long. In chapter 32, verses 1 through 4, we pick up the story. It says this, Now when the people saw that Moses delayed to come down from the mountain, the people assembled about Aaron and said to him, "Come, make us a god who will go before us. As for this Moses, the man who brought us up out of the land of Egypt, we do not know what has become of him." Aaron said to them, "Tear off the gold rings which are in the ears of your wives, your sons, and your daughters, and bring them to me." Evidently, the boys were wearing earrings back then. Then all the people tore off the gold rings which were in their ears and brought them to Aaron. And he took them from their hand and fashioned it with a graving tool and made it into a molten calf. And they said, check this out, "This is your God, O Israel, who brought you up from the land of Egypt." It's interesting in this section, Moses has gone too long, so the people do what they're best at doing. They complain. But what happens is that from our complaints, idols often follow. When one thing's not good enough, we're going to look for something that is. And so we continue with the story in verses 7 through 10. It says, "Then the Lord spoke to Moses, 'Go down at once, for your people whom you have brought up from the land of Egypt have corrupted themselves. They have quickly turned aside from the way which I commanded them. They have made for themselves a molten calf and have worshipped it and have sacrificed to it and said, "This is your God, O Israel, who brought you up from the land of Egypt." The Lord said to Moses, "I have seen this people, and behold, they are an obstinate people. Now then, let me alone, that my anger may burn against them, and I may destroy them, and I will make you a great nation." It's interesting that as these people are at the foot of Mount Sinai, creating this golden calf and dancing around it, the God who's on top of the mountain sees it, knows it, and is ready to deal with it. In all of our lives, don't forget that there is no unrighteousness that escapes the sight of God. We don't like to think about that because we know that we all sin and fall short of the glory of God, but the truth is that God sees all sin. And when we pray to God and we repent of these sins, we're not telling him anything that he doesn't already know. You can't shock God. He's always 8 steps ahead of us. I also think it's interesting in this passage that we know these people are making this golden calf, and as soon as God finds out these people that he has said that he would live in community with, he now doesn't even call them his people. He said, "These are your people that you have brought out of Egypt." The story goes on, verses 11 through 14, and it says, "Then Moses entreated the Lord his God and said, 'O Lord, why does your anger burn against your people, whom you have brought out of the land of Egypt with great power and with a mighty hand? Why should the Egyptians speak, saying, with evil intent, he brought them out to kill them in the mountains and to destroy them from the face of the earth? Turn from your burning anger and change your mind about doing harm to your people. Remember Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, your servants, whom you swore by yourself, and said to them, I will multiply your descendants as the stars of the heaven, and all the lands of which I have spoken I will give to your descendants, and they shall inherit it forever.' And so the Lord changed his mind about the harm which he said he would do to his people." Moses comes back and he intercedes and he says, "But God, if you destroy all these people and you start over again with just me, what will the Egyptians say? There were 10 plagues. Their army is underwater. And they're going to say that you saved these people to take them out in the middle of the wilderness to kill them? They'll think you're not a good God. And then he says, and also, remember Abraham, Isaac, Israel, Jacob? You remember those guys? You promised them that their descendants would be as many as the sands of the seashore and that there will be a land for their descendants. And these morons at the bottom of the mountain, that's them. These are the people that you promised. God, remember your promise. And so God relents. And a lot of things happen in the rest of this chapter. God does relent, but no sin goes unnoticed. And we find out that as Moses goes down from the mountain, he sees the golden calf. He asks Aaron what happened. He said, I threw gold into the fire and out jumped this calf. Liar, liar, pants on fire. And then he says, okay, who's with me? Who's not? God's vengeance would still be there because there are always consequences for sin. And we find out that 3,000 of the instigators of this complaining were killed that day by the sword of the Levites. And that there was a plague that was released on God's people that day to remind them that no sin goes unnoticed. The problem that they had here was as they had built this golden calf, God knew about it and he had sent Moses down. He had relented that he would allow them to live. They still were not penitent. There was still very little remorse in the camp. And so now they have a new problem. God's fed up with them, and he's already promised that he won't kill them, but he's going to do something far worse. And we pick up in chapter 33. Then the Lord spoke to Moses and said, depart, go up from here, you and the people whom you have brought up out of the land of Egypt, to the land of which I have sworn to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, saying, to your descendants I will give it. And then down into verse 3, go up to a land flowing with milk and honey, for I will not go up in your midst. He said, I'm going to let you live. Not only that, I'm going to let you go to this place that I've promised because I promised it, but I'm not going with you. And it breaks the heart of Moses. And Moses' response, we find out, is in verses 15 through 17. He says, then he said to him, if your presence does not go with us, do not lead us up from here. For how then can it be known that I have found favor in your sight, I and your people? Is it not by your going with us that we, I and your people, may be distinguished from all the other people who are upon the face of the earth? And the Lord said to Moses, I will also do this thing of which you have spoken, for you have found favor in my sight, and I have known you by name. A synopsis of all the things that I've read so far is this. God's children were disobedient. God says, I'm going to wipe them from the face of the earth, and you, Moses, with you alone, I'll start a whole new nation. But also, God is as good as his word. They deserved justice, yet he gives them mercy. They're reminded of their sin, but they're allowed to live. But their lack of repentance leads them to say, I'll give them everything that I've promised, but I'm not going to go. And it rips out the heart of Moses because he knows that without God, there is no promise. Without God, there is no joy. Without God, there is no real salvation. And that's where we start taking things away from this story. We start realizing that God's grace is not just big, it's epic. It's a larger-than-life story told about a larger-than-life God who does larger-than-life things, told in a larger-than-life way, that God is truly epic. So, why did I pick this story? What are the takeaways that we can take away this morning? Well, the first big idea is this. Ironically, even today, both impatience and familiarity create temptation to introduce idols into our lives. I always find it humorous to look at this scripture and I think, okay, what made these people decide that to build a golden calf was a cool idea? I mean, think about it. Think about all that they had seen. They had seen fire at night from the sky that was never consumed. They had seen a cloud to cover them by day from the scorching sun. They had seen a sea open up and shut. They had seen 1,500 tons of food fall from the sky every day. And when they were tired of that, God caused quail to fly so low to the ground that they could catch them with their hands. Basically, God said, you want food? Walk to the edge of your tent, fall face down, and chew. It's that easy. They'd seen all this stuff, and when they get to Sinai, the picture later on that the Apostle Paul tells, or the Hebrew writer tells, is that it's a place with smoke and fire and lightning, and something amazing was happening on this mountain, and they stand at the foot of the mountain, and they are still not impressed. And you know why they decided they'd build a golden calf? Because Moses was gone too long. That's the only reason. You see, impatience will cause us to create idols because in our heart, if God's not enough, we're going to try and find something that is. It happens today. Do you believe Jesus is coming back? Because, he's been gone thousands of years. Do you believe he's coming back? And your belief in him coming back, despite the long wait that we've had for this wonderful event to happen, does it cause you to doubt? And does that doubt cause you to excuse your behavior? For many people, it does. The long wait has caused many people to believe that maybe he wasn't God at all. And it's through that impatience that they start building idols that they create to be their gods. And it's also through that familiarity. The people like you and I who grew up in the church and we slept in the pews, bathed in the baptistries, we've done the whole thing. And we're so familiar with God. We're so used to seeing God work. We're so used to being around God things and singing God songs and praying God prayers that it just seems like old hat and it's just not a big deal anymore. We've taken the juice and we've eaten the bread and we do that every week and our mind wanders and we forget that that's supposed to remind us that even if we've had a bad week, we've had a good week because we belong to God. You see, it's that impatience and that familiarity that makes us create other things in our life that we will eventually put above God. That's what any idol is. And these idols, as I warned you last week, these idols will sap our relationships. They will inundate our time. They will take our finances. The three big things in our lives where we should trust God with everything, these idols will take them all away. And that leads me to this next takeaway from this lesson, and that is that all sin has consequences. Atonement can only happen through the resolution of conflict between the sin of humanity and the perfection of God. Let me share our reality. It's as sobering as Schindler's List. We're told in Romans 3:23 that we all sin and fall short of the glory of God. And in Romans 6:23, we're told that the wages of sin is death. We see that in this story. God says, these people have forgotten me. I will destroy them. Would he have been right to do that? Go ahead and shake your head, yes. But that's not what he did. And we stand in that same place. The wages of sin is death, and we all sin and fall short of the glory of God. So there has to be something that will bridge that sin. All sin has consequences. I had a dream the other night. Usually preachers don't share their dreams, but I had a dream the other night. Phil and I were headed to lunch, and he was going to double me on his motorcycle. You're welcome for that mental image. And we get out in traffic and we get run over by a church bus of all things, right? We're dead immediately. We both go to heaven. We meet Peter at the gates, and they're big pearly gates, and he says, y'all get in the truck. We're going to the big house, because he's from South Jerusalem. And so he takes us to Sarah Mansions. And so, believe it or not, Phil Cannon and I are neighbors in heaven. I bet you didn't know that. We live on the same cul-de-sac at the end. And we see these two big mansions, and he looks at that mansion and he says, wow, this is beautiful. Jana, when she gets here, she's going to love this. And I look at my mansion, and it's exactly what I want. Turrets on both sides, wraparound porch swings. It's beautiful. And I say, man, Melissa gets here, she's going to redecorate. And so we start walking to my mansion, and I see on one of the porch swings, there's this thing, this person, this human being. It is the ugliest human being I've ever seen in my life. And so I asked Peter, I said, who's that? He said, well, as you know, Joey, you did make it to heaven, but in your life you had many, many sins. And so it's a requirement that once you live in your mansion for the first period of time, you have to live with the ugliness of your sin. Well, I'm thinking to myself, it's a big mansion. How ugly can this thing be? The closer I get, the uglier it is, like a train wreck. The thing is, it's going to be okay. It's a temporary thing. So we leave my mansion, we go over to Phil's mansion. We're walking across the cul-de-sac, and we get closer to start noticing Phil's got someone on his porch swing too. It's Marilyn Monroe. One of the most beautiful people who's ever lived on the face of the planet. Here's Marilyn Monroe. She's on his porch. And I said, Peter, listen, I know Phil. He is better than me, but he's not that much better than me. To which Peter turns and he says, well, Joy, as you know, Miss Monroe had many, many sins. All sins have their consequences. I know it's just a big preacher story, but just think about it. Everything that happens, all of our sins are always going to have consequences. And so what we need more than anything is we need someone to bridge the gap between our sin, the reality of our sin, and the righteousness and the perfection of who God is. That's why Paul wrote this in 2 Corinthians 5:21. He said, he made him who knew no sin to be sin on our behalf, so that we might become the righteousness of God in him. He made the only perfect person, the only one who had experienced the righteousness, which is truly God incarnate. He made him to literally be sin on a cross so that we could be righteousness. We need that person who intercedes for us. And you see, we need someone to stand between our sins and his perfection, because that's the only way that we can be saved. Ephesians 2, verse 8 and 9 said, for by grace you've been saved through faith, that not of yourself, it's the gift of God, not as a result of work, so that no one may boast. We all sin and fall short of the glory of God. The wages of sin is death. We will live forever because there was someone who died in our place. And he saved us. But that's not what makes God's grace gargantuan. We talked about gargantuan. Gargantuan is one of those words that I like to use. A lot of people may not know what that means. It just means really, really big. It's not just Jesus coming and dying on the cross and saving us that makes us gargantuan. It's about who we're saved to. You see, misinterpreting the gift of salvation robs us of wonder. Because sometimes we misinterpret what the real blessing is. And that's our last big idea. To receive and find wonder and grace, we must realize that the gift of God is not blessing. That the gift of God is God himself. Salvation by grace is not about what we receive. It's about who we receive. The gift of salvation isn't about heaven. It's about God. We go down in this story that we began with in Exodus 33. And we pick up in verse 18 after he said that he would go with these people. And then Moses asks for what we all hunger for. He said, then Moses said, I pray you, show me your glory. What does that mean? God, I want to see you. I want to feel that closeness. I want to know your majesty. I want to feel the wonder. I want to bask in your presence. Show me your glory. And he said, I myself will make all my goodness pass before you. And will proclaim the name of the Lord before you. And I will be gracious to whom I will be gracious, and I'll show compassion to whom I'll show compassion. But he said, you cannot see my face, and for no man can see me and live. Then the Lord said, behold, there is a place by me. You shall stand there on the rock, and it will come about while my glory is passing by, that I will put you in the cleft of the rock and cover you there with my hand until I have passed by. And then I will take my hand away, and you shall see my back, but my face shall not be seen. Moses, after he hears that God's presence will continue into the promised land, says, God, let me see you. Let me know your glory. Let me see your epic nature. Show me your glory. And that's where we stand. This story of Moses and the Israelites going to the promised land is a microcosm of our story. Because you see, when God said he wouldn't go with them, what he told them is this. He says, I'll let you go to the promised land. I'll send an angel to protect you. And Moses knew that that wasn't enough. That without the presence of God, men are just men. Without the presence of God, there is no real holiness. Without the presence of God, we can't experience glory because that's the blessing itself. Think about what Jesus said to his disciples as he was about to leave this earth and he was about to go home to be with be in heaven with his Father. And he says, don't let your hearts be troubled. If you believe in God, believe also in me. For in my Father's house are many mansions, many dwelling places. If it were not so, I would have told you. And then he says this, I go to prepare a place for you. And if I go to prepare a place for you, I will come again and receive you unto my own. So what? So that where I am, you'll be also. In John's vision, that's recorded in the Revelation, he gets a sneak preview of heaven. In chapter 21, it said, and I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away. There is no longer any sea. And I saw the holy city falling down out of heaven like a bride adorned for her husband. I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, behold, the tabernacle, the house of God, is among men. And he will be among them. And he will be their God, and they will be his people, for he will live among them. This is long before he talks about pearly gates. This is long before he talks about streets of gold. This is long before he talks about crystal seas. Why? Because the most important thing we can experience is the presence of God. There is no blessing that can take its place. And if the presence of God is not what turns our crank, and in the presence of God is not what fills us with wonder, there is nothing about heaven that ever will. If the presence of God is not something that really motivates us, and the presence of God is not something that's a hunger from deep within us, then we have to understand that there's nothing else in this world that will ever satisfy us. Because this story is that grace saves us not for stuff, not for mansions. Grace saves us for God. Grace saves us to be with him. And every day of our lives, as we seek this gargantuan grace, as we're reminded of a big God who's shown us big grace in big ways, and it's told in larger than life form, as we remember all these things, let us not forget that at any time we can speak to God and say, God, show me your glory. God, show me your glory. And in some way, in some time, in some instance, he will place you in the cleft of the rock. And he will cover you there with his hand. And he will walk by and he will let you know that he's near. Because our God is living and he is active and he works in the lives of men today just like he's always worked in the lives of men, because he wants to save us for something unique, and that's to be with him. We worship a God that loved us so much that he'd rather die than live without us. That's huge. That's gargantuan grace. Let's pray together. Father, we love you, and we thank you for this morning. We thank you for this opportunity to read this story. And I want to start by praying for forgiveness, that we haven't always basked in your glory, that we have missed your wonder because we think that your gift is just blessings, when we all the while need to realize that your gift is you yourself. Show us your glory. Strengthen us in every way. Allow your presence to be in our lives and in this room, and change us in the ways that you would want us to be, so that we can show your glory to others. Place us in the cleft of the rock. Cover us with your hand so that we may know that you are God. We thank you for Jesus, who is that intercessor just like Moses was for the Israelites. We thank you that he pleads our case every day, for it's in him that we have hope and confidence and courage. We pray this in his name. Amen.